what is a coping skill? Coping technique, coping tip, coping tool. There's all sorts of words that, are used to describe it, but what is it? And is it important to have Catholic coping skills or Christian coping skills or faith-based coping skills? Does it make a difference? Well, I'm here to answer those questions. I'm Laura Nicola. I'm your faithful therapist. So let's start with the definition of a coping skill. So I would say that a coping skill is something that you implement when you have an emotional reaction to a situation. So it's something that you do in a reactionary way when you are triggered by an emotion. So let's say that, I am experiencing anxiety. A coping skill for anxiety would be something that I can do after I feel the emotion of the anxiety, or after I find myself in a situation that's producing anxiety. So I say that it's reactionary because it's in response to that specific trigger. Now, when we talk about coping skills, there's probably thousands of different things that we could call a coping skill. I usually break it into kind of a couple categories. So I usually say, okay, a well-rounded person will have coping skills that fall into the categories of spiritual, mental, and physical. So if we break those three things up and we find behaviors that we can do, skills that we can practice that fall into those three categories, we're doing a pretty good job. So let me give you just a few examples. So spiritual category. This would be a coping skill, could be prayer. It could be taking myself to the Adoration Chapel. It could be, just reading a spiritual book. Those are all coping skills. Those are something that I can do if I'm feeling an emotion that I don't want to feel anymore, and I do those things. That's a coping skill, and it would fall into a spiritual category. Let's talk about a category of, mental. So what could I do that is mentally helping me cope? Well, I could do a mindfulness exercise. I could draw and kind of occupy my mind in a different way. I could practice grounding techniques, which kind of root me in the present moment. Those are just examples of something, again, if I'm emotionally triggered, it's something that I can do to help myself feel better. Physical category. I could exercise. I could eat a snack. I could take a shower and, mindfully feel, the water on my skin. It could be anything is the point, right? It's just anything that we can do after we have that emotional reaction that brings our bodies back down to regulated baseline state. Now, I've had this conversation with multiple people about, well, coping skills just sound like things that I like doing. Or they just sound like my hobbies, or they just sound like things I do anyways. Well, that can be true. Like when we have like a hobby or, something that we, enjoy doing just in our free time, and we do it proactively, oftentimes that can be a coping skill, but it's preventing us from having an emotional reaction, perhaps. If I'm already in a state where I've had a good morning. I've exercised and I had a good, breakfast, and I got my prayer time in, and I was able to practice some gratitude. And then I go and I get in my car on my way to work and somebody cuts me off in traffic. I might be in a better mental state because of those proactive things that I did to take care of myself. Now, if I wake up and I don't do any of those things, and I get in my car and I'm on my way to work and somebody cuts me off and I have an emotion reaction, I'm triggered by that. Maybe it makes me think of, an accident that I got into previously, or, it kind of sets off my adrenaline because I had to slam on my brakes or something. If I have to then cope with that emotional reaction, I would say, okay, do a coping skill that is specific to that trigger. And it honestly could be the same things, right? I could still, okay, I just gonna say a prayer really fast. Okay, I'm gonna, distract myself and I'm gonna think about what I'm gonna eat once I get to my office because I have snacks there. Oh, that's right. Like, okay, I'm gonna exercise later. It could be planning to do those things, but even more specific would be a coping skill would be so specific to that specific situation of that trigger. So in my car, getting cut off example, a coping skill specific to that might be, okay, I'm gonna re-regulate my breath because like my adrenaline sent me into like, hyper mode. So I'm just gonna practice some deep breaths. Or I'm gonna turn on my favorite song and sing to it and try to distract myself and kind of just bring myself back down to a better kind of more regulated state. So you can kind of see the difference, right? Because again, I've had people say like, I don't want my whole life to be a coping skill. If I like watching TV, I don't want to be like, well, yeah, I'm doing a coping skill right now because I'm watching my favorite TV show, or, well, I'm going to, the sacraments, I'm going to confession because that's a coping skill. Well, yes and no, right? If it helps us proactively, we don't have to call it a coping skill. It's just something that's helping us be a healthy person. If something like that is helpful after an emotional trigger, like let's say I sin and I feel shame and I feel guilt by that. So a coping skill could be, okay, I go to confession to remedy that specific situation. So that's an example where it would be like specific enough where I could call it a coping skill if I want, but it doesn't have to be. The overall point is that coping is specific to the trigger, but a coping skill can be anything and everything that you do. And you don't necessarily have to call it a coping skill for it to be one. You don't specifically have to make it a different category than what you're already doing. It can just be, it can be empowering when we have that emotional trigger to say, I know what to do now. In therapy, we say like, okay, what's like your coping toolbox look like? Let's talk about all the different options you have. And that's an empowering conversation because usually it starts with people saying, oh, I don't have any. And then you start talking about, okay, well, what are the ways you take care of yourself? What are the ways you distract yourself? What are the ways you take care of your body? And that conversation becomes, oh, I actually have a lot of things that I am capable of doing. And so it's empowering to know that, oh, I didn't realize that I could do these things that I already do if I feel emotionally triggered. Oh, but I can. So it just feels good. Now, obviously, like this is like all very like generalized. Like I add in the spiritual category, in addition to mental and physical. Not everybody does, but there doesn't have to be a specific thing like a Catholic coping skill. So, it can be Catholic, it can be Christian, it can be faith-based, but it doesn't, like, we don't have to cope religiously in order for it to work for whatever emotional trigger we're having. I guess that's my point. Like our faith life, maybe is more on that proactive side than kind of the coping side. It's not right or wrong to, go distract myself with listening to music or go distract myself by going to mass. Like, is mass great? Of course it is. But it's not like better or worse in that moment to that specific trigger. And it might differ from day to day or situation to situation. So, there's no right or wrong, I guess is what I'm saying. And there's no specific Catholic coping skill that you're missing out on. So rest assured, whatever you're doing is already working. So just kind of run through, kind of those three categories. Say, okay, what kinds of things, fall into my spiritual, mental, and physical categories of coping? And can I maybe recall these things when emotionally triggered to do specifically in those moments? Again, reactionary is what I would call the coping skill. So hopefully that just like clarifies things, because again, so many people are like, oh, I don't cope. I don't have any coping skills. And then you start talking about it and thinking about it and you do. So be rest assured, that you do have coping skills. They're easy to implement. That's the purpose of them. So if you're needing like other ideas, just like Google it, and just say like fun, unique coping skills. And like, there's all sorts of stuff. I get the best ideas from kids. They come in and they're like, oh yeah, I literally had a girl a couple days ago that was like, oh, I decided to write a poem. And that was my coping skill. I was like, that's awesome. That's so cool. Like, who thinks to say that that's a coping skill? That's amazing. So it could be anything and everything, no right or wrong. Maybe just kind of go through and like figure out what yours are. And that way you can feel empowered when you need to implement them. So leave me comments. Be sure to subscribe on my other platforms and stay tuned for more videos. Subscribe if you haven't so you get notified. And we'll talk next week. Okay, blessings.